Harriet Tubman. She devoted her life to saving others. Sadly, she was born into slavery, but that wasn't how she let her life end. Born in 1819 or 1820 as Armita Ross to slave parents, Harriet, or otherwise known as Rit Green, and Ben Ross. Harriet was later nicknamed Minty. She was born on the eastern shore of Maryland. The exact date of her birth is unknown, which was common for the time, specifically for children born into slavery. Because of being born into slavery, she was raised under strict conditions and even endured whippings as a child. Minty spent most of her childhood alongside of her grandmother, who was too old and frail for slave labor. Unlike the other slave children, she did not work in the fields. Her master made her in charge of taking care of an infant at the young age of 5. Whenever the infant would cry, Minty would get whipped around the neck, which led to the first of many, many scars. At the age of 6, she was considered old enough to begin working. When she was about 8, she was hired to another household. One day, while her masters were having an argument, she stole a lump of sugar which she had never tasted before. Her mistress found out, and when she did, Minty ran away. She was found 3 days later in a pig pen where she had to compete with pigs for scraps of food. She continued her short-lived childhood up until the age of 11. After turning 11, she had to wear a bright cotton bandana around her head. This indicated that she was no longer a child and was looked at as a young woman. She was no longer called Minty, but Harriet like her mother. When Harriet was 12, she suffered a head injury, which happened at a grocery store. A fugitive slave was trying to get away, and his overseer saw him. The slave was running for the doorway to escape the owner, and Harriet got in the way of the overseer, trying to give the slave more time to escape. During this, the overseer picked up a heavy-weighted object trying to stop the slave, but hit Harriet in the head instead. This was the first of many times that she would be helping other people. Even from a young age, her behavior was extraordinary. It took months for her to recover. She would randomly fall asleep in any possible situation, and her owner could not sell a slave that had this sort of problem. She continued to live her life as a slave up until 1849. She then escaped to Philadelphia. Harriet was given a piece of paper by a white abolitionist neighbor with 2 names and told how to find the first house on her path to freedom. At the first house, she was put into a wagon, covered with a sack, and driven to her next destination. She made her way eventually to Philadelphia. She passed through many safe houses and was helped by many people. During this period of time, she also met William Still. He is known today as one of the Underground Railroad's busiest station members. With the assistance of Still and other members of the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, she learned about the workings of the Underground Railroad. In 1850, Harriet helped her first slaves escape to the north. In September of the same year, Harriet was made an official conductor of the Underground Railroad. This meant she knew all the routes to free territory, and she had to take an oath of silence so the secret of the Underground Railroad would be kept secret. In 1861, Tubman returned to the U.S. from living in Canada. The Civil War had begun and was enlisting all men as soldiers and any women who wanted to join as cooks or nurses. Tubman enlisted into the Union Army as a contraband nurse in a hospital in Hilton Head, South Carolina. When the Army sent her to another hospital in Florida, she found white soldiers and contrabands dying off like sheep. She treated her patients with medicine from roots and miraculously never caught any of the deadly diseases the wounded soldiers would carry. In the summer of 1865, Harriet returned home. Without a steady income, it was difficult for Tubman to make ends meet. She was in charge of her elderly parents and constantly providing for those looking for refuge in her home. Tubman sought compensation for her services during the Civil War, which turned into a 34-year ordeal. Because her services as a nurse, cook, spy, and scout were not documented, compensation was hard to get. All Tubman had received was $200 for her 3 years of service. At the age of 79 and 34 years after her first application, a widow's pension was granted to Tubman for the sum of $240 per year. Starting from the beginning of her life, Harriet had always cared about other people. She took care of the fugitive slave in the grocery store just like she took so many people to freedom. This pension was well deserved and she fought hard, even if it took 34 years for her to receive. In conclusion, we must think about all of the Civil War heroes who never received compensation for how selfless they were during the years. How many other individuals like Harriet do you think deserve more than what they received?